Alright, this is a Roland SC-7 sound module. It's got some very nice functions: an input on the front, a phone output and volume control on the front, also on the back. The power button, the power supply jack, two RCA outputs for right and left channel, another input, a volume control for this input, and the connectors for MIDI through serial, normal MIDI, and there is a selector for you to choose between them. Now I got this module for a discount because it's got some issues. First of all, a lot of noise on the output, and the outputs in the back are not working properly, so I have to figure out what's wrong and fix it. One good thing is that this thing came with the original manuals. They are a little dirty and they don't look quite new, but yeah, they are manuals and I like them. Now the Roland SC-7 is a device that came after the SC-55, and it's a simplified version of it. I believe that Roland released it to be used on more simple systems. It was a cheaper solution. And it's also quite practical to have those inputs and the volume control on your hand, because normally on a 486 or a 386 you would not have much control when you're playing a game. You could lower it on software, of course, but that would raise the noise levels considerably. So I took the device apart, took out the shields. They are quite annoying to remove because they are soldered on top on the back of the board. It covers the board completely, and I took it all under the microscope to see how things were, and yeah, the caps leaked all over the board and there was a lot of corrosion due to it. You saw me scrapping some traces, and I'm showing you some of the results of this leakage. And yeah, it's quite nasty, but I think it's fixable. Most of the traces, they look bad, but they still have connectivity. So if I just apply some tin on them, they probably will work again. If you have a look here, you can see how nasty the corrosion looks. But if you scrap it a little bit, the copper traces are still there. So yeah, I have some hopes for this one. Yeah, I'll have to wash the board because there is still electrolyte over it and it's looking very nasty. And there's also flux, and a very thick kind of flux. Looks like someone used rosin all over the board to do the soldering and didn't clear it. Really nasty. Now you see here near the main processor this gunky stuff on the traces. This is some sort of flux. It's very, very thick, and even isopropyl alcohol was having a hard time to take it off from the board. I'll wash it and even apply some warm water to see if it melts away. These are the offending little punks. As you can see, they are 10 microfarad and 6 volts rated capacitors. Pretty much all of them leaked and were below specs. I'm gonna use these ones in their place. They are not on the same voltage, but that's okay. The important part is that they have the same capacitance, 10 microfarads. They should work well enough. Now these two caps are part of the input circuitry for what they call input 2 on the device, and one of the caps leaked really strongly on the board. the trace has no continuity. This was one of the hardest ones to fix, because that solder over there on the pad is actually floating over nothing. There is no copper in the soldering island anymore, and the trace seems to continue under it, but there is nothing there. And it took me a while to repair this one. I'm gonna fast forward. I ended up using the capacitor LED to connect to the rest of the trace, whatever. By the way, at this point I had already washed and cleaned the board as much as I could with water and soap. Yeah, in here I try to measure continuity to see where exactly on the track it was broken, and I could not find it until I touched the soldering island itself. So it broke real close to the capacitor. By the way, I'm sorry I don't have the recording equipment set up to record the sound. I thought the microscope would, but it doesn't. That's why you cannot hear it beeping or not beeping. I'll try to make it better on a next video. I think I'll zoom in this area, and you're gonna be able to see the problem exactly, why there is no continuity. Yeah, and I think you can spot already the problem. Really close to the via, the trace is broken, right? I tried to measure it, and yeah, that's the spot where it ends. I could fix this with just a blob of solder, I guess, but the problem is when you're gonna see the problem in a few minutes when I touch it with this soldering iron. Yeah, and now when I use the iron, you're gonna see that it's just a mess. I believe that there is continuity in there, but you're gonna see that it just goes away. All the trace itself and the copper, they kind of disappear from the trace. Look at the trace, how it looks right now. It was more corrosion than copper. So no way. I decided to just use the capacitor LED to link to the thread, because on the other side there is no connection anyways. This is just a bypass capacitor or a filtering capacitor that's connected to ground, so no big deal. And as you can see, the trace is practically gone now. So I soldered back one of the LEDs of the capacitor to hold it in place. Okay, and I was about to solder the other LED in place. Unfortunately, there was nothing to solder it into, but that's okay, because as you can see, there is no connection on this side of the board. On the other side, this LED is actually, I bend it in half, so on the other side, the other part of this LED is coming up, and I'm gonna connect it to the trace, so it should restore connection, although it will look very ugly. But with all that corrosion, that was the best I could do. And granted that my soldering techniques under the microscope are still coming along, it was really hard to solder it on the trace. I think it's the corrosion, there's no other explanation. As you can see, it was happily soldering to the other component LED, or other component via over there, and would not solder to the trace at all. So it took me a while. Now finally checking if the connection is restored, and again, sorry for not having the audio, but yeah, it's restored. The trace is now working again. Now these ones, maybe it was not necessary because the copper was still there and there was connection, but it was still corroded, so I decided to apply some solder into it, and to make it stronger. I was afraid that the corrosion could continue even though I cleaned the board and washed it. I was afraid that the corrosion could continue over time and break those traces. Yeah, and again, it doesn't look that great, and it was kind of hard to solder over the area, although the copper was exposed. I think there was still some corrosion on top of it. I should probably get myself some tools to deal with that type of condition, because I'll probably find more of this. But yeah, it works. The traces are working as far as I can tell, and there is solder now on top of it to add some protection. Although there you can see some spots where it just doesn't want to hang to, right? Well, I decided it was good enough. soldering some more capacitors. This one was rather clear, and you can see how easy it is to solder when there is no corrosion, or at least less corrosion. And yeah, opening some vias to replace some more capacitors. All of these are of the same rating, by the way. This is something important that perhaps needs mentioning. I'm not a big fan of just replacing caps all around, and I know a lot of people agree with me on this one. But if you have an equipment where one particular kind of capacitor or cap, let's call it cap, I don't know how to pronounce it properly. One kind of cap is showing a lot of problems, like you have 5 or 6 of the same device failing. Probably the whole batch is not good. Around this era, on 90s, early 90s up to early 2000s, there were a lot of fake caps and poorly produced ones on the market. So that's why there is so much problem, why caps often fail so badly and with such bad consequences for the equipment. So if you see this, just replace them. And by the way, there are other caps on this board with higher capacitance and higher ratings. They are all okay. I even measured them. They are fine. It's just these small caps that are failing. And here some more problematic traces to fix or to at least test. And although it looks bad, mostly because the solder mask lifted from the copper, all the traces are fine. They still have continuity, no issue whatsoever. So I'll just apply some solder on that larger one and call it a day. So after replacing all the caps that were faulty and fixing all the traces I could find, I still had issues with one of the outputs on the back. The noise problems were solved and the right channel was working, but the left channel was bad. And having a closer look at the connector, I saw that someone already had worked on this. There is, as you can see, a wire connecting from the trace to the signal, to the positive of the signal path. So that's the signal source itself, and the via is quite bad. That wire is connected to the rest of the circuitry, and so you don't need that lower via to be there. So I just reinforced the soldering, but I still, after doing this, I still had no signal. It was puzzling me a little bit, and I tested the ground connector, and it looked soldered, and it was connected to the ground plane. So I was a little puzzled what was going on. I tested the signal to the inside of the signal connector, and it was also working. And then I decided to test the ground on the connector itself to the LED of the ground pin to the ground pin on the board, and there was no connection. Somehow the ground connection was cut on this one. That's why it was not working at all. So I had to restore this. And one option was to replace the connector entirely, but I didn't have one exactly like this, and this was secure in place, so I decided to just use a wire to connect the ground from the pin to the chassis of the connector, and that should solve the problem. It's not very elegant, but I really don't care as long as it's working and it's secure enough. And that's it. I was ready to test it again and see if it worked. So here are the results. I'm connecting the board to the computer using audio interface, a professional audio interface, and I'm using the MIDI output of this interface to drive the board. I'm using DOSBox because I think it's easier to control conditions for testing this way. First, the right channel, as you can see under the red connector, is plugged in. Now I'm taking it off. I wish I had shown it on the camera. Now it's on the white channel, as you can see, and it's working too. So both channels are working well. I think only the pot is a little scratchy, but I can live with it. I can also apply some deoxide on it, and it will probably be back to health. But yeah, it's working.